All right, hello there, students. So in this lecture, we're taking a step back from our focus on grammar terms, which we're going to delve pretty heavily into over the course of the next few weeks, to establish how I want you to read in this class. And that might sound weird or kind of like, what do you mean? But in a class such as this, where we are being very meta about our practices in terms of sentences and getting down to the base level of how a sentence creates meaning through the way that it's put together, um, that means that we kind of need to be reading in two ways. And the way that we're reading parallels the dual purposes of our class. So, of course, our class is a literature class in which we are reading poetry, we're reading short stories, we're reading novels, all towards the end of understanding how literary scholarship works and then practicing literary scholarship ourselves. At the same time, however, this is a writing class. And what that means is that when we read, we're not just reading for pleasure or to just understand the words on the page or whatever. Those are very important. But we're also reading as practitioners. We're reading as writers who are engaging with other writers through what we read. And so with that, whenever we read something in this class, and so today we'll be working with our short story, The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, you are reading that as a reader, as somebody who comes to this with expectations, with maybe no expectations, with an attention span, with all of your own personal life and experiences, etc., that then contribute to how you react to and experience the work. That's reading as a reader. Reading as a writer is then saying, okay, Mr. Poe, I'm a writer too, so let's see what you're up to. Let's get at your sentences to see what you're doing. What is your craft? How are you working, Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, with writing as technology? And so that might sound weird because, you know, he's been dead for almost 200 years. But at the same time, that is how I want you to engage with it. I want you to see yourself as an apprentice and a practitioner in some ways. And by the end of this class, you will no longer be an apprentice. You will be a seasoned academic and popular writer. And so to get there first, though, we need to know what it means to read as a reader, and then how to come back to our literature and to read as a writer. So, reading as a reader could also be termed close reading, which, if any of you have spent any modicum of time in a literature class, you have heard this term, right? And I'm going to give you much more in-depth strategies and definitions and ideas about close reading. But to start here, these are some basics that I want us to think about. So when a teacher tells you to close read, a lot of them mean a lot of different things. Some of us might think that that just means like close read, like this close, or I know, I'm such a doofus. But what that actually means, I think I want you to think about close as less like, you know, distance or whatever, and more as like intimacy. That you're really engaging with what the text is doing in a way that is attuned and attentive and close to the language. So that might sound weird, and again, we'll do a lot more with close reading in the next week or so. But for this first reading assignment, as you read through Edgar Allan's sort of masterpiece short story, The Telltale Heart, you need to engage with it just as a reader. And what I kind of mean by that is to kind of enjoy it, get into it. That's another maybe term for close reading. I want you to like get into the reading, and just note these things. So kind of try to remember what it means to read for interest or for pleasure. As somebody who was a PhD student for a very long time, I also kind of forgot what this was. But the whole point of close reading, the whole foundation of it, is to find things that grab you. that stand out to you. And so as a close reader, as you read as a reader, I want you to pay attention to the following things. What's the story about? So just like what's happening? That's plot, right? But again, like what is happening? What is, you know, what is alluded to? Like what's the background of this story? Like where does it come from? Like what sort of hints do we have of the world before the story starts, etc. How does it make you feel? And what does it make you think about? So again, those sort of bare bones reactions and feelings that literature produces in us. And finally, what is this imaginative piece of literature trying to say about the world outside the story? So to think about this, when Mr. Edgar Allan Poe sat down and wrote this thing, what's it engaging with in terms of the world, in terms of society, in terms of, oh, I don't know, mental health, or etc., etc. That's content. That's the higher order of meaning of a literary work. But we can't get to that unless we attend to what the literature itself is doing as literature, as its form, right? So some questions to ask when you first read something. So this, again, this whole method kind of asks you to read something twice, or at least attentively enough that you get good at doing both of these things at the same time. These are the things that you ask when you're reading as a reader. What happens? So, can you tell me point blank that you were attentive enough to the story to be able to say this, this, and this, and then it's over, right? What do you notice? This can be anything. Anything that grabs your attention, that you think like, we need to pay more attention to that because something's going on there. And why is it important? That combo right there, what do you notice and why is it important, is the bare bones foundation of any type of literary analysis, be it, what you're doing in this class to what, oh, I don't know, scholars at Harvard are writing about in terms of James Joyce or whatever. That's it. Did you notice something? Cool. Why did you notice it and why is it important? Make an argument for that. That's the foundation of every single literary argument. And as you start reading literary scholarship, you're going to find this out. Pretty simple, right? But, it requires finesse and we'll get there. But keep that in mind. That's the bare bones. What do you notice? Why is it important? Some literary stuff to watch out for. I'm not going to belabor us with literary terms, but these are just things that are kind of central. I talked about them when I talked about what you should look for in close reading in that handout, which means like literally what you should annotate when you're reading, or highlight using your screens, whatever. But these are just some kind of, they're not so much literary form. We're going to talk more about this, but just stuff to watch out for. That's sort of your signal of like something's happening here to create meaning and I should pay attention to it. Repetition, always important. Weirdness. This is sort of low-hanging fruit for an Edgar Allan Poe story. You're going to see plenty of weirdness, but just keep that in mind, that anything that strikes you as weird, make a note of it, because usually that's where things can happen in terms of literary analysis, right? Imagery, so any sort of images that strike you. Of course, here I have a little illustration of, the heart, the telltale heart. An image for me that I always get from this short story is the eyeball. That sort of weird blue filmed over eyeball that the narrator is so obsessed with. That's one image that always gets me no matter how many times I read this. Word choice, diction, tone, and point of view. And there are separate sort of guides for each of these in Canvas that I've put together. So do kind of go and look at those handouts to further flesh out what these terms mean and how you can look for them and interpret them while you're reading. And of course, now, stage 2. So we've read our short story, we've enjoyed it, we've gotten close to it, we've, whatever, but you've engaged with it substantively as a reader. Now it's time to read like a writer. And what I mean by that is that you need to return to the piece with your writer goggles on. I know. But what I mean by that is that I want you to return to each piece of literature that we read in this class and think about it as a writer. as somebody who crafts language and wields words to make meaning. And so essentially what you have to do when you read like a writer is consider how language has been put together and how that's making meaning for you, right? So with Poe's Telltale Heart, I want you to go back and I want you to think about what the sentences are doing. Find interesting sentences and just start to unpack them. How are they put together? What sorts of sentences do you see? Are they complete sentences? Are they fragmented? Do you see declarative sentences, which are simple statements? Do you see interrogatives, which are questioning statements? Do you see imperatives? An imperative is a command. And then finally, exclamatory sentences. Take note of those, maybe rewind us a little bit, because those are the 4 types of sentences. Might be something useful for later on. Exclamatory is an exclamation. And you know it's an exclamation because it has an exclamation point. But think through what types of sentences you see and what it means if one type is being used more than another type, right? How are tone and point of view, those things that we thought about as reading as readers, communicated through sentence structure? How does the makeup of a sentence and these little units actually tell us something about the narrator or tell us something about the narrator's emotional state, right? So to give you your foundation here, questions to ask when you're reading as a writer, as this practitioner of language. Sentence length. Long sentences, short sentences, an interesting blend of the two. Why does that matter? Sentence order, like are words in the right place or are they not? And what does that do? Patterns, that also goes with repetition, right? So a sort of union of literary form and syntax there. Typographical elements, which is your fancy teacher way of saying punctuation. You never would have thought you could interpret punctuation, right? But it's very intentional. So what is punctuation doing in this short story? And finally, going back to weirdness, again, this sort of thing we might not think of as a literary category of analysis, but for me is central. If I'm interpreting something, I'm looking for things that make me go, oh. It's usually a good starting point. Where do you see stuff that's weird or that sounds different than how you would speak or write it? Again, you're also dealing with something that was written in the 1800s, so that's something to take into account. You can read more about Poe on your own if you want, but I'm not really having us belabor historical context here. I'm having us think about how he wields sentences. So why is this sentence level weirdness important, right? And so with that, just a couple of sentences just to give you sort of a taste, of how would you go about analyzing these sentences as a writer. The very first sentence, true, exclamation point. So what's that? It's an exclamation. And so it's it's one of those weird things where it's technically a sentence and it's technically not. Some interesting stuff going on there. Nervous, dash dash, very, comma, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am. What are the verbs there? What's the noun of that sentence? Has the order been messed up from how you would say it, right? So this is a complete clause or phrase here that he's nervous. He had been dreadfully, very, very dreadfully nervous. Look at all those adverbs, right? He had been and is, or am. So he's still that. Semicolon, which means we're now going on to another complete phrase. But why will you say that I am mad? Question mark. What type of sentence is that? Interrogative. Good. Yeah, just sit with that. What's that saying? How are the words put together? Tone, point of view, etc. This next one, a little different. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. What type of sentence is this? as opposed to the sentence before it, what's up with punctuation here? Does the lack of punctuation mean something? We have tons of punctuation in that first sentence, whereas in this sentence, it's very straightforward. We take a straight journey, pretty much. So I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. That's pretty straightforward. But if we get deeper into it, there's a little bit of weirdness going on here. Like I was never kinder to the old man then. We have some comparisons. This sort of interesting equivocation or comparison of then and now. The word order, if you pay attention, might be slightly off to the ear. Sit with it and just think through it. And then this next one, which I'll let you all have fun with, if you'd like. This long sentence that just runs on. Ha! Which, again, is that a sentence? What is that? Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. What's going on there? And of course, I read it in a way that sort of tries to communicate to you what's happening here, right? And how, again, punctuation and these interjection clauses and that parenthetical, the dash marks, etc. What's happening here, right? So hopefully this kind of gives you a taste of what it looks like to read as a writer. You might also think about what you see me doing here in terms of highlighting your attention to sentence level stuff, right? So maybe return to this lecture as we get more into grammar and syntax this week to kind of see what's happening with these sentences, right? As we now progress to consider grammar and syntax more concretely.